All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the July, I can hear myself in my ear. This is the worst thing ever. So we're recording the session. That's why we have the little Bluetooth headset. I don't want to be especially cool tonight. But we're recording it. We've got some people that couldn't make the session, so we'll see how this works out. But welcome to the July Salesforce RVA Trailblazer community. We have a double header tonight. Really good topics. We're going to be talking about some process automation, tips and tricks. And then we're also going to be talking about the Dependency API, but that's not really its name, is it? No. Spoiler alert. Content's coming. Oh, got the clicker. Cool. So, forward-looking statement. I think everyone here knows what this is. And the reason we've got this here tonight is because we're talking about something in pilot. And so just generally, if you've never seen the forward-looking statement from Salesforce, this just means don't buy anything based on things we might show you tonight that don't actually exist in production. The agenda, we're going to do a quick round of introductions. Then we're going to talk about process automation. Then we're going to talk about the Dependency API. Q&A, we like to keep this kind of conversational. So as you all have questions during the slides, feel free to ask. Otherwise, hold questions till the end, but either way, it's fine. And then at the end, we're just going to wrap up with some announcements and upcoming events. So introduction. So hi, Adam Marks, Director of Salesforce Services at RTS Labs. We are a local Salesforce partner as well as custom development shop, business intelligence, DevOps, all that kind of fun stuff. With me as well is Ohad. Ohad is our co-leader on the developer group side.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then Matt, introduce yourself.
Sure, I'm Matt Comer. I'm with CapTech Ventures. I am a fellow.
Perfect. All right, so let's just jump right in and talk about process automation tips and tricks. So before we get into the tips and tricks, or really, I like to approach this from two perspectives. There are tons and tons of great blogs, knowledge articles, trailhead content that teach you how to use the various process automation engines, of which there are several, and we're going to get into those in a second. But we really need to understand, in order for us to be good stewards with the system, doing things appropriately, we need to understand why are we automating processes, right? And we're not just doing it because it's fun, although it can be fun, and we're not just doing it because we want to do things in the system. We want to identify root business problems and solve them through automation. So what are some of those reasons why we might get involved with process automation? From a Salesforce perspective, and just generally with technology, it helps drive adoption and improves usability of the system. If I'm a user and I have 10 steps to complete a process on paper, and then you put me on a new system and I still have to do all 10 steps, I'm probably just going to go to the path of least resistance. I'm going to fall back to my muscle memory, and I'm just going to go do things on paper. But if you take my 10-step process, put me in a new system, and I only have to do 1 or 2 steps, there's a really good chance I'm going to stay in that system because you're creating efficiencies for me that's benefiting me as a user, and I'm going to want to continue to use it. Another reason why we do it is because business process is complex and unintuitive sometimes or all the time, right? Sometimes things just don't make sense. And sometimes we need to take the things that don't make sense, clear them from our minds, and just let computers do what they're good at, which is repetitive tasks amongst other things. Third one, and this is something that I talk about a lot, especially when I'm working with service clients, is it helps increase the business's capacity without adding FTEs or employees, right? So if I'm a business and I want to increase capacity, I have several ways in which I can complete that. One of the ways is hiring. There's cost associated to that. Or I can increase the capacity of my current workforce. And a great way to increase the capacity of my current workforce is by automating mundane, repetitive tasks. Again, repetitive tasks aren't fun. Computers are way better at it. And finally, why process automation? Because it's a click-not-code approach. And that's what we want to focus on in the first half of tonight's doubleheader, is using Salesforce's declarative tools, meaning we don't need to know how to code. If we do know how to code, how can we build something in Salesforce without necessarily having to write code? Because there's overhead involved in that. And again, that's what we're going to be focusing on. So the TLDR, or too long didn't read, less manual stuff equals time and cost savings, and businesses like time and cost savings. All right. So again, it's a click-not-code approach. Another reason why we're going to do it, because not everyone understands what we're looking at right there. So that's a trigger. If you write code, you can probably look at that and know exactly what's going on. If you don't write code, you might look at that and say, hey, that means nothing to me. And that's actually just the trigger. That's not even the trigger handler. There's no business logic in what we're seeing right here. And I wish Andrew was here. That slide was for Andrew, and he didn't show up tonight. Oh, did you? Did he approve it? Okay, good. Because that's an exact quote. That's an exact quote from Andrew. So again, not everyone's a developer, and that's okay. But everyone can build process automation using the declarative tools. I'm an accidental admin. So that's something that is true of me. I'm sure it's true of a lot of you. You started a job, you didn't do Salesforce, you were given Salesforce, you became an admin, and now you're responsible for doing a lot of things on the platform. And it was never your intention to do so. So the accidental admin is a very common tale that we hear all the time. And then process to create efficiency should not outweigh the efficiency created. And so I mentioned that there because sometimes when you write code, and I've seen this before in org, where there'll be a 200-line class to update a field when a record's inserted into the database. I've seen something like that, right? You can do that in the process builder. You can do that in workflow rules. That's a lot of overhead for something that you can do without a lot of overhead. So the TLDR in here, businesses need to get stuff done with the resources that are available to them, and sometimes that's a declarative admin.
Just one small thing to it. It probably fits better in the previous slide, but one of the reasons to use process automation in general, all these things that Mark talked about, that Adam talked about, was all great. But one of the things that I always feel is my one driver to do business automation is that people make mistakes and they make a lot of them. Right? So whenever I can eliminate the human element from a process of data entry or process automation, I'll eliminate it because I know that I can fix it. Like, if I have enough data to make it automated, then why would I ask a human to do it? Right? I can save them time and eliminate errors at the same time.
Yep. And the more we do a task, the more we repeat a task, the more error prone we are. All right, so let's do Salesforce Declarative Process Automation 101. So who here has used the declarative engine, workflow, process builder, flow before? Quick show of hands. Is that everyone? Almost everyone.
Bobby.
Okay, perfect. How many people knew there were 3? And there's technically a 4th one, although I rope approvals into workflow. How many people knew there were 4 different automation engines? How many people feel like if I threw a scenario at you, you'd know exactly which one to use? Yeah, okay, I don't either. Honestly. So, you do? Yeah? I want to talk to you afterwards then. No. There really is. There's a lot of overlap. And again, we had that forward-looking statement earlier. Maybe some point in the future we'll get things a little more consolidated. But today, there's 4 of them that you need to be aware of. And again, I rope in approvals and workflow under the same umbrella. So, workflow, the OG declarative process. Workflow has been on the platform for a very long time, and as crazy as it is to think, there was a time in Salesforce life where there wasn't any declarative process automation, right? But workflow was the first. Workflow has a very direct approach. You have a triggering event, and then you have an action that takes place. So it's really easy to conceptually think about when you're thinking of, I've got a process, it's a 5-step process, something happens, and then something else happens, right? There's an event that triggers it, and then there's an action that takes place. Can be triggered by a database insert or update. So that's data in the system. That's a record being created. That's a record being updated. That's how workflow is triggered. That's how those actions end up executing. What can you do? Oh, and approvals. You can send email alerts, right? So send an email out. You've got a template. You want to send an email to somebody, you can do that. I can update fields, but it's important to note only on the record that triggers the workflow and its direct parent. That's it. I can create tasks. Creating tasks are great. Workflow allows you to create tasks. What other kinds of records can you create with workflow? Just tasks. So you can have any record you want as long as it's a task. That's a Henry Ford quote. And you can send outbound messages. Who knows what an outbound message is? So outbound messages, if you went and looked at the developer documentation, you might get a little scared if you're not a developer, but it's really saying, I want to take data in Salesforce and I want to send it to an endpoint, right? So we think about APIs and how systems talk to each other. You can actually send data out to an endpoint that's been stood up, although it needs to kind of specifically be built for that outbound message. So you can't just go out and find something with webhooks that's already stood up. It might work, probably not. So a little bit of disclosure there, but you can actually do some data transfer that you would do with an ETL tool or where a developer would build an API for that via the outbound messages. And actions can be instant or time-based, and we have a whole slide talking about time-based logic, so we'll just kind of pause. Process builder. I like to think of it as the evolutionary upgrade to workflow rules. It still follows that simple kind of triggering event action methodology, but now you can have multiple steps involved in that. So it's not just one if-then statement or if-else statement. Now you can have multiple if-else statements in a more complex process. You can also do more things. For example, they can be triggered by the same thing we talked about, a database insert or a database update, so something data related, or when a platform event occurs. So if you're familiar with listening services, which is basically the system is listening for something to take place out there in the ecosystem, right? You can have platform events that can cause a process to be invoked, and then your actions take place. You can also have what's called invocable processes, such as another process. So a process can kick off, you have your criteria, it evaluates to true, and then another process is out there, and it has actions associated to it, and that process will kick off and those actions will take place. So what can you do with it? Well, you can do everything you can do over here with workflow, and then we've got some bolt-ons. You can call an Apex class. So there is something called the admin trigger, which is a combination of headless flow plus process builder. So that's the admin trigger, and we'll kind of mention that again a little bit later. But you can also call Apex too. So if you're working with a developer and they've written some code that does some logic behind the scenes, without needing to write the trigger, you can actually use the process builder to call that Apex. You can update any related record. So if I have an account and 200 contacts, I can have a process on the account update all 200 contacts at the same time. You can also update any record in the database. For the most part, there are some objects that are not exposed, but for the most part, your standard objects and any custom object that you build, you can interact with. You can do a quick action. The actions platform on Salesforce, it's getting better. You can do a lot more with it. I don't think it's quite there yet, but if you're not familiar with the actions platform, it's definitely worth a spin on Trailhead to kind of get familiar with it, because you can build your action and then you can call that action to, again, create data via the process. We already talked about invoking a process from another one. You can launch a flow. So that's that headless flow we talked about. So flow, and we'll get there in a second. You've got screens that the user can interact with, or you can just have flow logic. And so if the process is calling that, I think they call it something different than headless flow now, but I always know it is headless flow. You know what they call it? Is it auto launch? Okay. That sounds a little less scary than headless flow. So auto launch flow, we'll go with that. That's our new vernacular. Yeah, around Halloween we call it headless flow. And then again, email alerts, you can post to Chatter, submit a record for approval. So those approvals that we built using the workflow engine, that without or prior to a process builder, you would have to have a user click a button and submit for approval. That really feels kind of self-defeating to me, to have to tell the user to go like click that button, because we already talked about this. Users either aren't going to use the system or they'll forget to click the button. So you can actually create the logic around when does that approval need to be submitted. And again, actions can be instant or time-based. And finally, flow. And then flow has a bunch of different names. You might have heard visual flow. Now, lightning flow is the new term for it. Flow design interface.
So who here heard of flow? And now who of these people use flow? That's impressive. Yeah. Flow is one of those things that a lot of people just are scared of even starting to try.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little more intimidating than the other two.
Yeah, it is. I think this thing muted.
The what?
It does. It definitely does. And there's some hard limits. We have a client we're working with now, and they had a flow and everything was going great. And then they started to get collection errors because the object they were iterating over has more than 10,000 records. And for some reason, they were purging all of the records in the object and then reinserting them. So we had a good talk about that. And then we said, okay, there's definitely a line in the sand between what we want to do and what we can do in flow. And then at some point we need to go to code. But I think flow is worth definitely diving into. It's not scary. once you get familiar with the menu. But don't get super familiar with it because, again, forward-looking statements, there's a brand new flow interface that we should see spring-ish, safe harbor, maybe at Dreamforce. So it can be triggered. So a button or link on a page, right? And that's any type of Lightning page. So that's a community page. You can embed them on email, Paint Lightning pages, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Visual Force, custom tabs. Users can access them on the utility bar. I don't think a lot of people know about the utility bar, but you can actually, there's that bottom bar at the bottom of the Lightning screens, you can actually embed different actions and things there. So you can have a flow that's launched right from the bottom of that page. Across the board. Yep. Apex can call a flow. Flow can call an Apex. They're best friends like that. And so again, what can you do? You can call Apex, create records, delete records, right? We haven't seen that one pop up, so that's something new and possibly exciting and scary. You can, a flow obviously can launch a flow. You can post a chat or send an email, and not just an email alert. And there is a technical difference between an email alert and sending an email. A little bit of it's just vernacular. You can submit a record for approval or update any record. And there are objects that I believe are exposed in Flow that aren't exposed in Process Builder, although I can't think of any off the top of my head right now. It used to be things around like content distribution. Like I don't think you can hit the content objects in Process Builder, but you can do like content records, like for files and attachments and things like that. So, all right, so selecting the right tool for the job. Workflow. I like to use workflow still for the simple stuff, right? If I want to update a field on the object that I'm interacting with, right, I'm going to use workflow for that. If I want to send an email alert, I still like to go to workflow for that. If I'm going to create a task, I still like to go to workflow for that. For Process Builder, starting to get a little more complex and specifically for multi-step processes. So I want to update child records in bulk. We gave that example a few minutes ago. I have an account, 200 contacts. Something happens on the account, like the address changes on the account, and I want to update all of my contacts. Process Builder, beautiful for that. I want to kick off an approval or there's the headless flow again. I can do that with Process Builder. Execute multiple actions in a single process. And so we'll talk about that in a minute, but you've got your different nodes in your Process Builder, and it's not just evaluating one line and then that's it. You can evaluate a line and then go down to the next one. So you can have a single process where you're evaluating different things and potentially having multiple data elements or actions happening within a transaction. And again, I can post a chatter. If I'm going to do a chatter post, I like doing that in Process Builder.
Really just updating not just children, but any related record or any record that you can figure out the ID from somewhere on the record being updated, something that you have access to.
Yeah, it's actually really good, especially now when workflow first came out, it was not bulkified. So you would blow up system limits real quick. But now that it's bulkified, yeah, those bulk updates, it's what I go to first if I need to do any kind of bulk job. I like to use Flow for the really complex stuff. So Flow, at least my interpretation of it, it was really designed around creating wizards. So you have like a 4 or 5 step process where screen 1, capture this information, go do something in the database, return something back. Screen 2, rinse and repeat. So that concept of a wizard, you can still build those. So if I have something like that, I'm going to try to build that in Flow. Insert or update multiple S-object records. So we have the example a couple slides later, but I've got a flow in an org where you fill in one form. It's like 10 fields, and then it creates an account, a contact, an opportunity, and inserts a contact role. Right? 10 fields happens a lot quicker than it would if you were moving through Lightning and doing that manually. It's a great purpose for a flow. And then no-code triggers. So we talked about that admin trigger, and that's really a process calling that automated flow, where the flow is just handling the logic and the process is what's kicking that off. All right, some visual examples. So this was just in case nobody had seen it. I think everyone's seen these, so we'll just kind of move right along. So this is an example, an older one, of what workflow looks like. So you have a rule name, you have your criteria down here. This was in my phase where I like to write everything like I was still writing Excel formulas, but you've got some different options there. So workflow screen. This is the Process Builder screen. So we kind of talked about those nodes. And this is really just a visual if-else statement, right? So you're basically saying the object and then What is my criteria to evaluate this node? And then these are my actions. And I've got those immediate actions and I've got scheduled actions. And this is what I was talking about here. So this stop, if I'm building a process and I click on stop, I can actually tell it to move down to the next line. So I can completely evaluate one line. And then I can say, cool, instead of just dead ending and that's the end of it, I can say, go down to the next line and see if we need to keep going down on this process.
Basically, the difference between if, else, to just separate ifs, right? If this, then do this. If this, then this. Where the if criteria are not mutually exclusive.
Yep.
So meeting one if doesn't mean you shouldn't check the other.
And scary flow. Does that look scary to anybody? A little bit? You can say yes, it's okay. It looked scary to me too the first time I saw it, which was earlier today. So this is an example of a flow, albeit kind of a fairly involved one. This one's looking up records, we're inserting records, we're deleting records, we're building a collection. So we're basically saying, hey, I want to grab all this data. I want to store information in variables. So we got a little bit of everything in this one. They're normally not quite this scary. And like I said, if you've never seen the flow interface, it's definitely good to get into. And think of a real simple use case. Maybe I challenge everyone to go back if you've never built a flow. Build the one I was talking about earlier, where you have a few fields on a screen. You enter in those fields, and then you create an account, a contact, an opportunity, and insert that contact as the primary contact role on that opportunity. And it sounds like a lot, but I promise you, everyone in here can do that, except maybe for OHUB. All right, the power of time. So time-based actions or time-based workflow is something that a lot of people don't realize you have available to you. So we understand the concept of, hey, something happens in the database, data's inserted, data's updated, and then there's an action that's executed immediately. Send that email, update that field, right? Post a chatter, do whatever it is. But you can tell the system to hang tight. Is it still recording? Okay. You can tell the system to hang tight for a minute and do something in the future, right? So we've got a couple examples here. I think I used the same example multiple times of what if I want to, I have an opportunity to close one, and I want to send an email 10 days after it goes into a one stage, right? You can do that with time-based workflow, but you have to approach your rule criteria a little bit differently. And this is where, in my experience, most people kind of trip and fall because we're used to that something takes place, immediate action. So in the past, or if you were writing that as an immediate action, you might write something, a formula that kind of looks like this. So is closed and today minus close date equals 10, right? So that's basically saying, hey, if the opportunity is closed is just a system level field on opportunity. And if we're looking at the current day and we subtract the close date, if it's 10, that means 10 days later, we want to send that email out. Okay, that seems pretty legit. But what happens if that opportunity is closed and nobody goes and makes an update afterwards? Because we know that in order for that action to take place, the system has to evaluate what? A record insert or a record update. So if I close my opportunity and then nobody does anything else, that email is never going out. So we have to think about it a little differently. And what we're actually doing with time-based actions is we're asking ourselves, what would take place in the system for this action to queue up? I want this action to go wait until I've told it to go do what it needs to do. And so from that perspective, and we're oversimplifying a little bit, we can just simply say, it's closed, right? My opportunity closes, that action goes and waits in the queue, and then I define that I want it to actually take place 10 days after opportunity close date, and then it just does it. Does that make sense? Cool. Time-based workflow is really powerful, and again, a lot of people don't realize that it's just available, and it's available in both Process Builder and Workflow. You just kind of have to train your brain to stop thinking about the kind of immediate, like, hey, this is the criteria, and this is when that action would take place, and think to yourself, what would trigger this action to queue up and wait until that future date when I actually want to have it take place? All right, so let's get into some tips and tricks. With Workflow, don't fear formulas, right? When and this is actually kind of backwards to how I build my processes. In Process Builder, they have a nice UI where you can select all the fields and conditions and things like that, and they account for things like, hey, is a record changed? Is a value null? And in workflow, it doesn't account for any of those things. And so I like to say, don't fear formulas. Get in there, write formulas. Go ask on the Trailblazer community if you have questions. Steve Moe is almost always available if you know who Steve Moe is, right? And you've got kind of two styles. So I mentioned it before. You've got the Excel style and maybe more traditional code syntax. And so those two formulas there in the middle say the exact same thing, right? It's the stage name is changed, so that field is changed. So the prior value is different from the new value, and it's closed. Two ways to write the same thing, whichever one looks less scary and more like something that would be readable to you. You want to use qualifiers to ensure that your workflow does not execute at the wrong time. And again, is changed is a great example. So if my workflow criteria is just, is this opportunity closed? And I go in and I change a field on that opportunity and it's still closed, guess what's going to happen? That workflow is going to execute again. And that's probably not what we want. So we use modifiers and we create the right criteria so that it only happens exactly when we want it to. For example, when the opportunity goes from open to closed, the syntax of is changed, stage name, and is closed would take care of that for you. And it will only execute when you go from an open to a closed status.
Also a field that people don't understand a lot of time what it means in workflow and in process builder. And it's, I can't remember the exact text, but it's something like only execute when specific changes to the record meet the criteria.
Yep,
so that
it's a process builder, yeah.
You could actually have a process that just says is closed equals true, and you say only execute when changes to the record meet the criteria. And then Salesforce knows only if you change it to say it's closed, only then execute.
Yep.
But two ways, again, to accomplish the same.
Correct. Yeah, you just want to think to yourself, what's that total encompassing criteria that I want to use in order to kick off this process and not have the process happen multiple times, unless that's what you want to have happen, in which case that's fine. You can use recursion to allow field updates to kick off other workflow. So recursion just basically says this process will review itself multiple times. So a great example of that is when you have field updates. So you might have a field update and that new value you want to trigger something else. So you create kind of this cascade of automation. You need to run your process or workflow in recursion. Otherwise it will stop. And that's it. You won't have those subsequent processes take place. I don't necessarily, so I put this in here because this is kind of an older trick for like long ago if you wanted a workflow to always evaluate. I don't recommend doing this on Process Builder ever, or really even workflow. But if you ever just had a use case and you just needed the workflow to always execute no matter what, just do a simple 1 = 1 or something just kind of simple like that. Explore outbound messaging. Again, it is situational. But if you happen to have a service or if you come across an app vendor or anything like that and they're set up for it, there's an endpoint or you're developing or working with a developer and they build that endpoint for you, outbound messaging is a great way to get data off platform and also to get a response without necessarily having to go to code. And then use it. Like seriously, it's still okay to use workflow. A lot of people feel like they have to do everything in Process Builder, and that's just not the case. You can still use workflow and that's perfectly fine. Process Builder, using field references to map data between S-object records. So there's actually an interface where you can look up and map data between different records. So instead of having the hard code values or remember what a value is or store it somewhere, you can say, hey, I'm going to create this new task record and I want to map it to a contact record. You can actually do that in the interface and you look up to the fields on contact so you can map all that data together. We already talked about this. Process nodes don't always have to terminate. You can evaluate a node and you can move on to the next one. Automating the kickoff of an approval process. And I feel like that's the right way to do things. Instead of having the users click submit for approval, go ahead and do it for them. Calling a headless flow, aka again, the admin's trigger. Controlling your processes with a custom setting. So this is really about kind of creating different means to say whether or not the process will evaluate. So you can create custom settings that say, hey, this process only evaluates for some user types and not others. You could do it by role or by profile or even at the user level. So there's a concept of a kill switch, which isn't the nicest way to say that, but it's really just, hey, if I needed to kind of quick and dirty deactivate something or just blanket at a user level, say whether or not a process takes place, you can use custom settings to evaluate that. Consider a single process builder approach. So you would basically have a single process that is that calls other processes. So it's kind of that same concept of when you're building a trigger. Your trigger is just saying when the trigger handler is invoked. Is it before insert? Is it after insert? So same kind of a thing you can think about when building your process. And then use time-based actions with 0 hours to execute the actions asynchronously. And so this is a way to kind of get around some system limits, although I haven't hit any limits with kind of synchronous updates and things, but so you have?
Yeah, we've definitely.
Oh, with process builders?
Especially when you have
Yeah.
code as well as
Mm.
some declarative stuff.
Yep.
You can also
Gotcha. Perfect. Yeah, because there's no way to define order of execution across different processes running unless you actually build into your criteria and have a bunch of like checkboxes and stuff. But at that point, probably going to want to go to code anyway. All right, flow. So the biggest one, don't be scared of it. You can learn it, and there's amazing resources. So Salesforce MVP, Jen Lee, that's her website. Mark Ross, another great flow, another Salesforce MVP. Brian Kwan, the Salesforce Wizard, another MVP. Salesforce MVP program. There's so many great people out there teaching and helping guide the community. Those are great resources to learn flow. Again, real basic. If you have a use case where it sounds like you need some kind of wizard or something, it's a multi-step process. Go ahead and build it. The worst thing is, it doesn't work and you get help, but I promise everyone in here can do flows. And so that example again is that account wizard that we talked about a few times. Flow screens understand, they do now at least, the difference between Classic and Lightning. So you build your flow screen and you don't have to tell it I'm in Lightning or I'm in Classic. And if you're viewing it in Classic, it'll look like Classic, although nobody's on Classic anymore, right? Andrew Sim's not here. I can make that joke. And then if you're in Lightning, it'll look nice and have the SLDS styling applied to it. This one's really cool. You can add flows to a Lightning email pane and use it with Lightning for Gmail or Outlook. So we've done this a couple times now where you've got a user group, for example, maybe users are taking inbound email quotes and right there inside their Outlook, there's a form, it's a flow. They fill in all the information and then behind the scenes you can create accounts and contacts and opportunities and quotes and all sorts of cool stuff because your flow is living right there in that sidebar component in Gmail and or Outlook. I think that's awesome. I'm a huge fan of that. I hope Inbox gets that feature at some point because once you go to Inbox, there's so many cool features, but you can't customize it like that. It's really the only downside to Inbox, in my opinion. And Lightning Flow is getting better with every release. And Lightning Flow now encompasses a bunch of different things. There was actually something in the summer release on the service side about guiding your reps through a specific process. That's part of the Lightning Flow engine. So it means a bunch of different things now. And we just linked out to some release notes talking about, this is actually a blog that Andy Fawcett wrote that talks about, I don't know if you've seen it. This one talks about extending Lightning to really create a solution that even a few releases ago would have required code. So that's kind of a cool read. And then general tips. Automation can be more than just business process. So think about how can you create a cool experience for your users that's not necessarily driven by a business process. So things you can do, for example, changing record types behind the scenes, which automatically flip page layouts, right? Cool stuff. Something that I've done many times before. You can.
You no longer need with Lightning because now you can have conditional Lightning.
That's the next one. So update hidden fields off the page layout to have conditional Lightning components. So I don't know if you guys do this, but Lightning components can have conditions set to them as to whether or not they show up on the page. So you can have a process that checks a box behind the scenes, that boxes off the page layout, and then all of a sudden the Lightning component shows up, right? If you wanted to do that, or you could just have it be based on filter criteria. I just think sometimes it's easier when you have like checkboxes that you know what the criteria is for this. So field history limits, I've seen this before. I don't recommend this if you need something that's like in a heavily regulated or compliance use case. But if you're hitting limits, maybe you have 26 or 27 fields you need to track instead of the 25 that you get with field history tracking. You could build your own history object and you could use a process to say when a field changes, grab the old value, grab the new value, put it into a related record. You can report on that. Again, doesn't necessarily fix things, or I wouldn't recommend it at the enterprise level, but in a smaller environment, you can definitely circumvent some limits and you can keep going. And change or enforce field formats. So I have a statement. I like to say validation good, automation better. So for example, instead of putting validation rules that enforce case sensitivity or that they have to have a phone number formatted the same way, just do it for the user, right? We all like to write regular expressions for fun. So go ahead and just do that for the user. instead of blocking them and saying, no, rewrite this field, just let them enter it and use a process to update or change the format of that data and insert it for them. And they'll love you forever, even though they have no idea that you've done it for them. And that's it.
Before we hand it off to Matt, out of everything that you've seen here about process builder and automation in general, is there something that strikes anybody in the audience here? Would love you guys to spend more time talking about this use cases. Is there? Yeah.
The one thing that I found with flow is information about how to document what your automations are doing, because you can get into where you have listing things or where you does not capture all of the possibilities of criteria, so you end up with a scenario that doesn't trigger something. So that to me is something that's really helpful, just to understand some of the best practices around how to even plan out what that automation is like.
Yeah.
You can get into the technical side, because that to me is the hard part. I'm finding it very easy to build things, but then I'll say, oh, this could actually happen. Unlikely as it is, I want to capture that and make sure I can. That's where I feel like I'm very much amateur playing with tools that are powerful, but I don't want to end up.
That's a good point.
That is a good point. Yeah.
Anything else? Anybody in here something that they'd like to learn more? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Guided engagement.
Yeah. So that was part of the summer release. I think is it still beta or is it GA now? Either way, but that's part of that Lightning Flow. So it's just one of the new things that Flow has made available. I think it's specific to the service side now, but I don't see why there's any reason why you couldn't with Flow do kind of something similar. But the guided engagement's really around creating almost like knowledge articles and then presenting them to users at certain points during a process. And so I can't remember if it's GA or if it was just beta, but if it is beta, it should be available in org that has Service Cloud enabled.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. We'll definitely take these into.
Oh yeah. Go ahead. Yep. Yeah, the task is a common one.
I like a different approach where I don't want to get into too much detail, but there's a different approach where you can actually email into a Salesforce email and
don't have a copy back
to the record as a related email. So it's absolutely doable by using a thread ID. No.
No, so he's saying when you have a workflow and you send out an email alert, it doesn't save it as task related to something. So how do you capture that?
So I'm really concerned about the ear hygiene of these two guys.
And you should be.
Yeah, it's not making me super comfortable, but okay. All right.
You can just keep it.
Yeah, that's not great either. All right. Again, I'm Matt Comer. So I was very mindful of the audience tonight. And so really trying to strike that balance between going a little overboard on the technical side and really losing all the folks in the room, their admins. And so I thought about it. I said, okay, let me try to come up with some content that'll make sense to everyone. And so if everyone leaves the room feeling somewhat dissatisfied, right? I either got a little too much or a little too little, then I will have succeeded, which is a great setup, right? Yeah. All right. So a couple of initial notes. So The actual formal name for this capability is not, in fact, the Dependency API. It's the Metadata Component Dependency Query. And we'll get into why that's important. It's not really an API at all. It's an object that you can query via the tooling API and capture a lot of interesting information about the dependencies in your org. It's in pilot. It's not generally available. What does that mean? So, Salesforce typically goes through a process of pilot to beta to GA, right? So we're even pre-beta here. That being said, it seems pretty mature, right? And so, I think we'll see some progress pretty quickly on that. CapTech is in the pilot. I had to sign an agreement about our participation. And so that is something that I had to be cognizant of as I'm presenting this information to you guys. So there are some limitations, some things that are being worked on, some things that have been discussed in terms of, this should be available by the time we go GA. I can't really get into any of that because that's all subject to the terms of the agreement. I do expect this capability to make its way through beta and GA quickly, but I don't work for Salesforce. Even if I did, I couldn't say that. And so that's certainly in no way a promise, right? All right. So first of all, it struck me that if we're going to talk about the Dependency API, we need to understand what a dependency is, right? What is a dependency? So Merriam-Webster says it's something that is dependent on something else. Okay. So kind of circular wording, right? It didn't really clear it up for me. So I said, well, all right, what does that really mean from a software engineering perspective, right? When in software, what is a dependency? All right. This isn't fitting me very well, so I'm just going to hold it like this. All right. So it's basically a broad term that basically says I'm using something else, right? My functionality is dependent on, requires some other capability. It's related to something we call coupling, right? So I've got two things that can't necessarily work independently, right? Something that is being dependent on could probably work on its own, but the thing that is dependent on that may not be able to stand on its own. It has a dependency, right? So if program X uses library Y, then X depends on Y, right? Does that make sense? Pretty basic stuff, but it's important. All right. So as a basic concept, that makes sense, but on Salesforce, what does that mean? And so it's important to understand, and the folks in the room that, are developers and work on some of the deployment situation, et cetera, are probably pretty comfortable with this, but Salesforce is all about customizations in metadata, right? So we've got metadata that represents all the customizations and even the out-of-the-box capabilities that exist on the platform. Those customizations, right, all that metadata is related either to the platform itself or to those other customizations, right? So it makes sense, for example, that, and I got some examples, here, and this is just a very short list of examples. There's hundreds we could talk about and identify, but we build customizations that build this chain of dependencies, right? When I add a custom object and then add a custom field to that object, and then write an Apex class that accesses that field in that object, or write a flow or a process builder that access that field on that object, I've created now a string or a chain of dependencies. So if you think about, Apex is often dependent on objects and fields or other Apex classes. A report, dependent on the report type. The report type's dependent on the objects that are referenced, right? Objects and fields. A custom field clearly is dependent upon the object. Objects have lots of interesting dependencies, some of which are very obvious because they're in the object XML, and some which are not quite so obvious. Lightning components can be dependent on static resources that you've embedded, or Apex, the Apex controller, certainly, et cetera, right? So some of these dependencies are clear. If I write a Lightning component and I write an Apex server-side controller for that Lightning component, okay, I get it, right? There's a dependency. Sometimes things get a little more complicated, though. And so unraveling that and understanding that is extremely challenging. All right, so I wanted to talk briefly about something. I got to figure out how to do this and also hold this. All right. So what we're talking about here is not entirely new. There have been ways to understand the dependencies in your objects, and this is going to be tricky. should have thought this through. How do I look over there and drive? Has anyone ever used, the package manager to analyze dependencies? Okay. So the package manager is a capability. Thanks, Ohio. That's very clever. All right. Often what we find is that there are certain capabilities that get delivered primarily for ISVs, for people who were doing managed package development, that then end up being incredibly handy for everyone else, right? In fact, the entire metadata API, there's so many things on the platform that probably were originally intended for one use case and now have come to be, used for something completely different. So the package manager is an interesting tool that can be used to help us unravel dependencies. And it's because under the covers, there's this thing called the spider. Now, I did some searching around to try to find any documentation on the spider and when it was implemented and who's responsible for it and what the technology really is and et cetera. And there's nothing really mentioned, but I've heard some, like Dreamforce and Trailhead DX talks about it. And so basically you can create a package and pardon any typos. Live demos, right? All right. And let's say we say, well, all right, I want to find out what dependencies a certain Apex class has. So I could go and say, you know what, let's actually take a look at this Apex class. Well, behind the scenes, what Salesforce is going to do here is say, that's great. So you want to add that class to this package. Well, there's probably a whole bunch of extra things that you need to include that you didn't think about, right? And so sure enough, here is a whole bunch of other stuff that's been automatically added to this package that I had no idea, right, was somehow related to or dependent. The Apex class that I selected is dependent upon all of these items, right? So we've been able to use this for a while. And in fact, this was a trick we used quite a bit early on in taking a look at extracting metadata into Salesforce DX, was to say, well, I'm not really sure what I need to extract. Let me add the things I do know. That'll build a package XML that I can then use to extract all the metadata, and the spider will have already figured out all of the other pieces of metadata that I needed, right? All right. So that was that short detour. So under the covers, this is presumably using the data structure that we're getting ready to talk about. And this is something that I plan to grill Andy Fawcett on to find out if it's true. But my suspicion is that what this metadata API or what this dependency API that we're about to talk about really is a window into the data that the spider was already using in the package manager to be able to understand the relationships between metadata and, what all the dependencies are. Yeah. There we go. All right. Yes. All right. So we know that we can discover this information about dependencies already, right? I just showed you. We can use the package manager. That's not new. That's not in pilot. That's available to you now. Why is this a big deal, or why would we care? What's the point? Well, there's a lot of interesting things we can do with this information even now, even if you're not thinking about DX and unlock packages. You could use it to unclutter your org, right? You could say, I've got a suspicion that I'm not really using this piece of metadata anymore, that I got a custom field here. I'm not really sure if it's being used, but I don't think so. Well, here's a way to find out, right? You can use the package manager, add that, and see if anything else gets dragged along. And then I'll show you how we can use this new tool to do exactly the same thing. It can also help to understand how various parts of your org work together. So I don't know how many folks have ever had to sort of dive into some customizations that you yourself didn't write. I'm a consultant, right? So I'm often having to do that. And so you're, trying to figure out, well, where's the end of this ball of string, right? How do I get in? Once I get started, hopefully I can make some sense of it, but what's my way in the door, right? So you could start to pick things apart by saying, well, let me pick something, let me unravel the dependencies, let me sort out what's related to this, and it can help you build this mental picture of, okay, I think I understand now how all these pieces and parts fit together. But most of all, most important, and the reason why this is really so kind of earth-shattering for those of us in, they're doing development right now, is because of unlocked packages. So I'll talk about that. Okay. So I think we've talked about unlocked packages a little bit here in this forum. Did John do a presentation? Yeah. So when I first started doing work with Salesforce, it hasn't been that long. So about 6 months after that, I went to Trailhead DX. That was not this year, but last year. Salesforce DX was just going GA at that point. And we started playing around with it a little bit and came to the realization that, okay, if I'm an ISV, if I'm developing managed packages for the App Exchange, this is it. This is the thing, right? DX really revolutionizes the world of ISVs because they can create their package, they can spin up a whole bunch of scratch orgs, all different shapes. They can run all their tests, do all their scripted and automated testing against it. So it's all the magic that they need to really separate, themselves from having to worry about and manage a whole bunch of sandboxes and figure out how they're going to test all their customizations in a whole bunch of different org shapes and et cetera. So great. As an enterprise developer, though, which is what I mostly do, turns out that it really isn't that helpful because you still get this gigantic mess of metadata. You've got all the customizations in your org. You don't know how to organize it all, how to modularize it. There really isn't a mechanism that lets you modularize all the customizations with DX out of the box, right? So unrelated project teams, unrelated developers are having to figure out, well, how do I avoid stepping on other people's customizations? How do I avoid even having to understand what all these changes are that are going on? It also doesn't help us get our code out of a scratch org. So scratch orgs are great, right? But what is my pipeline? What does my deployment pipeline look like? DX doesn't really tell you anything about how you get changes out of a scratch org. You still have to use a metadata API. So we still have to use all the tools that we currently use, Capado, GearSet, AutoRabbit, the Ant migration tool, change sets. Whatever you use to kind of migrate things through sandboxes for testing, for production deployments, et cetera. Those don't really go away with DX out of the box. So we were kind of frustrated and said, this doesn't really do it. Well, along come unlocked packages, and there's been a couple of names, developer control packages, packaging 2.0, next gen packaging, while we're really talking about kind of all the same thing here. So the packaging 2.0 or next gen packaging is really an umbrella for a couple of different things because managed packages are also a part of next gen packaging. So there are packaging 2.0 managed packages, but that's not what we're talking about here. This is what we're calling unlocked packages. And like I said, Salesforce has changed the name on this 1 or 2 times, but I think that this is the final name. I don't know. We'll see. Yeah. So what is an unlocked package all about? Well, an unlocked package is a way to modularize code in an enterprise development environment, and then have that code in a Salesforce DX workspace and not have to have all of the other customizations in my org all mixed up in that same workspace. So I can be working on a project. I can be doing some coding on the front end for a set of capabilities that we're building, or maybe just the data tier for that, depending on how I've organized our packages. Or maybe we've got a vertical package that's this new app we're building, but none of the other apps that we have in our org, right? So we can have just what we need. And if we have dependencies on other things, because let's say we've customized some standard objects and we also have some custom objects, like let's say we have a common logging framework where we write some messages to a custom object to log errors in our org. Well, we can have that off in a separate package, and I can use that as a dependency, but I don't have to have that code in my workspace. And I can declare that I depend on that. And then when we go to deploy these things, no more do we have to worry about doing metadata API deployments into sandboxes or into production. All we have to do is install or upgrade the packages. So imagine a world where, as a developer, I make some changes. I release a new package version. That's just something I do using the DX CLI or my IDE. And then I call up my, friendly admin and I say, hey, we're ready to test this new version of this capability that I've built. Could you go ahead and upgrade the package version on X to 1.05? Sure, no problem, right? Click, done, no change sets, no ant migration tool, no gear set, no whatever that you use. And it's very easy then to go in and see what versions of things are installed. We can see, oh, this is the version of this package installed in this sandbox. This is our QA environment. That's been validated and tested. We can now migrate that to production and feel confident that we've tested the thing that we're in fact releasing. So it's extremely groundbreaking and important. One of the key things is that unlike a lot of the other metadata dependencies, which you have to discover in some way, and we'll talk about how in just a minute, dependencies between packages are declared. So your package itself says, I'm dependent on another package, and here's the package version. So it's very obvious. All right. So how does Dependency API help with unlocked packages? Sounds like unlocked packages are great. Why do we need the Dependency API? Well, unless you're starting a new project, you've got some challenges that you need to sort out. We've talked a lot, and John has done some talks. He did a talk at Trailhead DX. Everyone who's in this space is really thinking about what are strategies we can use to either start building new capabilities with unlocked packages or start taking all the stuff that we have in our org today and turning that into one or more unlocked packages. And by the way, for the admins in the room, unlocked packages aren't just code. So every piece of metadata in an org, let me back up. Almost every piece of metadata in your org can be part of an unlocked package. There are some unsupported metadata types. There are some that probably will never be supported. There are some that just aren't right now and in the process of being supported. But at this point, most everything that you would routinely use is packageable. Not everything can go into a managed package. Believe it or not, the unlocked package support for most metadata types is better, right? But all right, we've got a whole bunch of custom. Let's say we've got a bunch of process automation stuff. We've got a bunch of flows, got a bunch of process builders. We've got a lot of custom objects and custom fields on standard objects. And we've got lightning components. We've got layouts and list views and just all sorts of customizations that we've accumulated in our org over the course of 8 years, right? You name it. How do we turn that into a set of packages that makes sense? We'd like to start dividing that up into some capabilities because we'd like to be able to then enhance those applications moving forward, make changes, not have to have the entire org off in a sandbox to be able to do it, right? Well, okay. It turns out that this is the hard part of everything we've talked about with unlocked packages. Figuring out how to decompose a large set of customizations is hard because of dependencies. You start thinking about, no problem. This app is about these 2 lightning components. Great. I'm going to put those in a package. Wait, that package won't deploy? Oh, it's complaining about some Apex classes. All right. I'll add those Apex classes. Still won't deploy? Oh, it's complaining about some custom objects. Okay, right? So you go through this whole process of figuring out, essentially by failure, right, what all the errors are that come up because you haven't thought through all the dependencies, right? Well, that's the point of everything that I'm about to show you is there's now a way that we can query and explore and discover a lot of these dependencies. Does that make sense?
Not just the sandbox you were talking about.
Okay. All right. Well, and so real quickly before I jump into showing you some of the demo, what I wanted to do here is focus on the data. So again, this is really actually a fairly simple capability that exposes one object to you via the tooling API that has really 6 important fields. Now, there's lots that can be done with that data. And in fact, a lot of the value of what we're about to see is really going to be driven by people other than Salesforce who build tools that sit on top of this. And so rather than focusing on that, because there's already some cool tools that are starting to accumulate out there, I'm not going to show all those because I was only given 20, 25 minutes. So we're just going to look real quickly at some of the data. And in order to do that, I'm going to use 2 real simple tools that I'm sure you guys are familiar with, right? So I'm going to use Workbench to kind of show you what this object looks like real quickly. And then I'm going to use Developer Console to run some queries, right? And show you what some of the data looks like. And just a couple of real simple use cases and say, what if I wanted to know X? What would that look like, right? So just know that there are actually some really cool like visualization and graphing and querying and other tools that are already starting to be built out there. So Andy Fawcett, the guy who we keep talking about, who sort of is a champion for this capability, has written a sort of experimental plugin that people are starting to build other things off of and et cetera, that actually will query all this data and give you this crazy looking dependency graph that shows you kind of visually what this all looks like. Because one thing you do run into is that, so there's no concept of self-joins, right, in Salesforce. And so this is, again, one object that actually points to other instances of records in that same object. And, you know, it sort of spiders down into a long tree. Well, you can't query that on the platform. So really what you have to do is suck a lot of this data out and then use other tools to analyze it. And so that's where a lot of the real value is going to come from. In fact, one of the reasons why they're really encouraging folks to be involved in the pilot is to start to be able to build tools that actually make use of this data. So hopefully that makes sense. Exactly. Yeah, though I guess Andy, you know, he's with Salesforce now, right? So, all right. So first, let's take a look at this object. Let me go grab the URL. Yeah. What is Workbench indeed? All right. So what happened to my, there it is. Workbench is I think it's actually PHP, it is, yeah. It's an off-platform tool that's actually, this instance is hosted on Heroku. You can get the sources and host your own copy if you'd like. It lets you do all sorts of cool things like run queries, do some data operations, you know, update, edit, delete records, run anonymous Apex, use the REST Explorer, which is what I'm about to show you, to exercise the data APIs, the tooling APIs, even the metadata API, et cetera. So there's all sorts of things you can do in Workbench. I find myself flipping back and forth between a couple of IDEs, the Developer Console, and Workbench, just sort of depending on what feels right at the time. So I tend to do most of my querying. For some reason, if I'm just want to run some queries and, you know, get some SQL right before I put it in an Apex class or something, I tend to do that in Workbench and not in the Developer Console. I don't know. So whatever works for you, right? Yeah. All right. So what I did here was I basically had already gone in earlier and navigated through the REST Explorer to use the tooling API, right, to describe this metadata component dependency object, all right? And the key thing to understand is that there are 6 fields here that are really interesting, right? You got the metadata component ID. Well, I guess I left out namespace because I'm not working in orgs that are namespaced currently, right? So we're not talking about really exploring metadata in managed packages here. Unlock packages can be namespaced as well, but right now there's probably not a lot of compelling reasons to do that. So I left out the 2 namespace columns. But basically there's a set of fields that are sort of on the left-hand side and a set of fields that are on the right-hand side. And what does that mean? Well, this set of fields describes a certain piece of metadata, and then this set of fields describe a set of metadata that piece is dependent on. Does that make sense? So this is referenced by that. Okay, well, what does that mean? It's a little confusing, right? If we think of it simply as some component name, let's say this is an Apex class. Well, what would an Apex class be dependent on? Another Apex class, a custom field, a custom object, etc. So let's say we had an Apex class, and we'll run some queries later and show you, that was dependent on another Apex class. We would see the name of the first Apex class on the left-hand side, And then we would say see the name of the second Apex class on the right-hand side, right? This is dependent on or references, hence the names of those fields, that. And so it's really that simple. You've got a series of records that describe that this references that. Or if you look at it the other way around, this is dependent on that. Does that make sense to everyone? And that's really all there is to it. So if that's all there is to it, why do we need to build tools? Well, I'll show you. Let's look at a couple of use cases. Let me grab a couple of queries here. And I couldn't, so let's, for example, ask the question. And let me get my developer console up first here. And then we'll ask the question. Yeah. Workbench is currently not aware of this object. Right. So you cannot. Workbench will tell you that that object doesn't exist. All right. And that's because Workbench apparently has some logic in it that goes above and beyond just sort of describing and discovering the objects. Whereas apparently, as long as you click Use Tooling API, the developer console will basically execute whatever query you give it. Right. So let's say I have a custom field called WD integration status. And by the way, this metadata is all around a capability that we built in our own org. Probably freaking Evan out because I'm demoing from our live production org, but that's okay. If we wanted to ask the question, what items depend on this custom field, right? Maybe we thought, this thing is probably not getting used, right? Can't we just delete it? Let's find out. Use tooling API, execute. Now, one thing I have noticed is this is not particularly fast. And if you think about it, well, I did a count. There's a number of thousands of records in this object just in our org, and our org is not particularly large. If I were to execute queries against a certain org for a certain client whose building we might be in, then I could imagine that this would have some other challenges, right? And that's one of the things, I will say, no one tell on me, that is being discussed in terms of the pilot is how to make this perform a little bit better. It's not terrible. It's just that because of the way this data is structured, almost none of this data is indexed. And so that means that when you put criteria on a lot of these queries, you don't see performance improve that very much. And it's because, like, for example, almost all these ID fields and et cetera are actually just strings. They're not really IDs. And, you know, so there's some performance challenges that, again, they're not bad. You don't see problems with limits and timeouts and et cetera here, but it can take a few seconds for these queries to come back. So that's one thing that's being worked on. So, yeah, so here we have the answer to the question, what are all of the objects that depend on that custom field, right? And so we can see there's a number of flows, layouts, email templates, a couple of Apex classes, et cetera, that all depend on that custom field. So no, we wouldn't want to delete this, right? Obviously, it's currently being used.
Or if we make change,
we might impact. Exactly. Or another way to look at it would be if we wanted to package some of these things, that field would need to go. And see, and that's the other thing. So I'm looking at this currently from sort of the right-hand side, right? Whereas you can turn it around and look at it the other direction. You can say what depends on or what is dependent on, right? And that's sort of the beauty of the data structure is you can query it in either direction.
the one comment that I want to make is that Matt's presentation is obviously geared much more towards developers. At this point, it is almost purely developers. Also, as Matt said, other companies are starting to figure out how they can use it that others can use. And the implications of something like this is extremely important for administrators as well, because of exactly
right.
that I think, relatively short time.
So we could certainly see managed packages available on the App Exchange that might let you ask questions like, yeah, if I change this, what might be impacted, right? So all those capabilities suddenly become available, which really aren't today, not easily anyway, right? So here's a different question. This is, okay, what is dependent on this custom object called WD user? I don't know, let's find out. Didn't click. All right. So again, a very interesting response that tells you, you know what? I've got flexi pages, right? I.e. lightning record pages, right? So things that you don't necessarily immediately think about to say, well, wait a minute. Yeah, of course, right? I've got maybe a couple of record page definitions for this custom object. So if I touch this, I might need to go and change those, those record pages, might want to add some fields to the layout or do whatever I'm going to do, right? But I've also certainly got a number of Apex classes that could potentially be impacted, a bunch of flows. This obviously shows that a number of, this object is referenced multiple times in the flow, et cetera. So that's another one of the things that we've been talking about is, since there really isn't a select distinct concept, for example, in SOQL, it'd be nice if we could eliminate some of the apparent duplication. These are not technically really duplicates, but because the information is not surfaced here about where in the flow is this being referenced, it effectively is a duplicate, right? So figuring out ways to exclude that just so it's not noisy, Now, if you're running queries like this, you sort of have to deal with it, but the tooling can just throw away those duplicates, right? So let's ask a slightly different question. So far, we've sort of been asking what depends on X. Let's turn it around and look at it as what does this depend on? So now we're going to find out for this Apex class Workday Sync role IDs, what does it depend on? So much more reasonable, but you can see that. So obviously it references this field on this object and a couple of other Apex classes, right? So it's a great simple way to say, oh, okay, now I know exactly. So, and this is the kind of query that we've been using a lot to do this sort of package decomposition activity where we say, this needs to go. I clearly understand that this is part of this thing that I'm trying to package up, right? It's part of some feature I built, but I can't remember everything else, right, that needs to go. What else did I change? What else did I add that might need to also go along? Well, this says, if you're going to send this Apex class along in that package, you better send that object in that field, or at least that field, right? If some of this gets into the design of, well, does the object come along in another package that maybe this package is dependent on, right? There's still some of those design questions. But certainly all of these items, that object, that field, and these two Apex classes need to be either provided directly in the package that you're building or by some package that you are dependent on. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay. Just to highlight, and I'll do these quickly, that there are some peculiarities in the data that are interesting and let you ask some questions that you wouldn't even think you could ask. So I'm going to ask a question that I'm not sure there's any easy way to ask without this, and that is, what are all the Apex classes that have a schedule job associated with them? I don't think you can ask that in any way currently in Salesforce. Well, you can now, because cron trigger is a metadata type that's exposed, and so you can say, what are all the dependencies of cron trigger? Now, yeah, in our org, it's pretty simple because we use a technique where we've got a little wrapper class where we abstract all of the actual jobs away from the cron trigger so that we can actually do deployments, right, without having to disable all the jobs. So you can see, oh, we really only have one class that's directly a dependency of a trigger, and everything else is just this schedule dispatcher. But if you're not using that technique in your org, then you would see all the Apex classes that you can't, in fact, do deployments against because they're currently involved in scheduled jobs. One other interesting little highlight, and then I'll wrap up. So far, we've looked at a lot of metadata, and I don't know, so you may have seen a few little oddities, even stuff that I've shown so far. There are, so I didn't talk a lot about what each of the fields were, right? But as you can see, you get an ID, a type, and a name for both the left-hand side and the right-hand side. And this metadata component ID for both is where things can get a little bit weird, because for all of your custom objects and custom fields and et cetera, those IDs are all real metadata IDs. For a lot of the out-of-the-box stuff, things don't work exactly that way. So here, for example, I'm asking, well, what are all of the objects that depend on opportunity? And you can see I've had to treat that a little differently because it's a standard object. And so I've actually had to say ref metadata component ID equals opportunity, which is not really an ID at all, but that's the way the data is in the object. So this is kind of interesting. It highlights all the things that are actually depending on the opportunity object in our org, right? All right. So questions or discussion on this real quickly? Yeah, so that's probably one of the things that I can't talk about, unfortunately, because there's some of those that are in the works right now to get fixed up. There's not, yeah, there's not very many, and they're very actively being worked when people in the pilot group, et cetera, identify them, because it's very clear, right, that in order for this to really be useful, it needs to have pretty decent coverage across all the available metadata types. So the more gaps there are, then the less useful this will be. And so everyone is pretty focused on trying to make sure that there's good coverage. The data, let me make sure the data handles it very well in that they're described perfectly well. Again, the problem of, so you discovering that is going to be something that you have to do yourself. In fact, so if you think about it, there are very, very many very normal occurrences of circular dependencies in Salesforce. So most of the time, that's not even a big deal. So for example, and we probably could have seen it on a prior query that I did, page layouts and objects and fields, right? I mean, how do you unravel those? And in fact, you don't. That's why in the metadata API, they're really, completely bound together. DX splits them out a little bit for you, but they're still really, pretty tightly coupled. So it's not those kinds of circular dependencies you need to be aware of, but there are certainly lots of other ones, particularly on the Apex side, for example, where that can lead to some real challenging deployment problems. You got to package all that stuff together, otherwise you can't deploy it at all, right? And the data exposes that very easily. The data exposes it. You still have to be able to understand it. And that's where, again, because you can't do self-joins, this really comes down to pulling it off platform, right? Running a big query and then writing code to go through and say, let me follow all of the left-hand side to right-hand side. Now turn that into a left-hand side, come back over, right? And just keep following that. And if I ever realize, oh, I've touched the same left-hand side more than once, I'm in a circle, right? Something's not right. So. As in, apply.
What this profile is dependent on objects.
Yes, profiles and permission sets are included. There are some challenges around it. The beauty is you don't have, because this is not the metadata API, you don't have limitations around, a lot of times permission sets are much better now, but profiles you still really can't, it's very difficult to get to answer the question, show me everything that's in this profile, right? Very hard to get that question answered. You can do that much more easily here, except that, of course, this is only metadata, right? So org preferences and settings and all that kind of stuff, that's not exposed at all here, right? So it would only be references to OLS, FLS, right? Things where you're referencing other metadata. Well, thank you guys. Thank you guys. Yeah.
One is sort of a survey of RVA.
Mm-hmm.
Two is dependency calculation. How is VS working for managing? This module needs version 1.3, and this module needs 1.0, may not be active. Breaking collision. And the last thing would be, I'll find it later.
Your dear friend John Daniel.
I know what it is. It's more of an architectural question. You touched on it. It's the art of module decomposition. I have this work. I'm moving towards VX. Obviously, there's art to it. What are some approaches?
Well, and those are great because that is sort of where all of the buzz and thinking is going on in the space right now. Yes, how? And what we're realizing is that there's probably several answers and several techniques, and picking the right one is going to be a matter of what works for you and your org, and how much development you want to do, and how much you want to go back in time and clean up what you got versus sort of.
I suspect that.
Much more art than science.
Yeah.
So I think that's more of a discussion.
I suspect that we will continue to have DX-specific sessions in the near future, where we'll talk about topics like that and probably others as well. But you know who to post those questions to, so.
A couple more quick things before we wrap up. As always, big thank you to Permjeet. I think he had to step out in the Carmax for hosting. Wonderful partnership. We look forward to hosting in forever and ever and ever. We're planning for the next meetup, but we don't know what the content is yet, so that's where we want to hear from you. So post on Meetup, post on the Trailblazer community, tell us what you want to hear. If you like these double headers, we'll keep doing these. If we want to go more in depth or even do like a hands-on session, tell us, right? The content is for you all. And we want to make sure that it's things that are topical and that you guys want to come out for. And I figured since we were talking about pilots, and we'll share this out there so you don't have to memorize that URL, but if you're interested in getting involved in the pilot program, the short version of this is just talk to your account manager. But the longer story is there's an FAQ about it, but it really just says go talk to your account manager. Get in touch with us. So there's the Trailblazer group. There's the Meetup for as long as that's around. That's the Twitter handle for the RVA SF UG. Thank you, everyone.
Make sure to drop